Everyone, and welcome to the second public panel discussion that kicks off our annual Captagon Trade Conference for today. We're thrilled to have you with us for what will no doubt be a robust discussion on the growing U.S. Counter-Captagon strategy with State Department Near Eastern Affairs Bureau Deputy Assistant Secretary Ethan A. Goldrich and Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Deputy Director Hae Jung-moon. My name is Caroline Rose. I am the director of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Strategic Blind Spots portfolio, where I lead the Captagon Trade Project. For the last 3 years, we've organized this conference with the goal of fostering discussion between experts, governmental officials, and civil society actors to shine a light on Captagon's various implications for public health, human security, geopolitics, and more, as well as explore the various policy pathways that the United States and its partners can pursue. You can find a recorded session of civil society's perception of the Captagon trade on New Lines Institute YouTube page, and you can register for our last panel, which will take place tomorrow, on Captagon's growth in the Middle East and Europe, scheduled for May 16th at 10 a.m. EST, online on the New Lines Institute Eventbrite page. It's been quite an eventful year since we last convened the Captagon Trade Conference, with signs that the trade is rapidly evolving. While industrial-scale production continues to be anchored in regime-held territories in Syria, there are signs now that the trade has encompassed small-scale production deep into mainland Europe and neighboring Iraq, while smuggling operations have adopted a kinetic nature, with traffickers engaging in violent, sometimes fatal clashes with neighboring border security forces. With this, the Captagon trade has become a common agenda item for recurring regional normalization discussions, with the Syrian regime an emerging feature of Middle Eastern geopolitics. As a response, the United States has built upon its interagency strategy, formally established last year, initiating a second round of sanctions against identified Captagon manufacturers and trafficking agents, as well as formally including Captagon in the US-led Global Coalition Against Synthetic Drug Threats. Yet, while the United States and its partners have come a long way in strategizing to curb this illicit challenge and promote accountability, the trade continues to evolve and encompass sophisticated, advanced mechanisms to bypass and undercut controls. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two leaders at the U.S. Department of State that are on the front line of this emerging U.S. strategy. We have Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, Ethan A. Goldrich, who has led a rich career within the U.S. Foreign Service. Goldrich began his service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in September 2021, with responsibility for the Levant and Syria engagement. He previously served as Foreign Policy Advisor to the Commanding General of the Joint Special Operations Command in August 2018 to June 2021, while equally serving as the Office of Director for Arabian Peninsula Affairs in the Department of State in February 2021, where he provided coverage as chargé d'affaires in Manama, Bahrain, and Abu Dhabi. Prior to his JSOC posting, he served as the Director of the Office of Levant Affairs and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of State, Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi, Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Belarus, Director of the State Department's Office of Caucasus Affairs and Regional Conflicts, Deputy Director of the Office of UN Political Affairs, Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, Near East Watcher at the U.S. Embassy in London, and Head of the Political Section at the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. Mr. Goldrich served as a civil servant in the State Department's Office of Soviet Union Affairs and holds a bachelor's degree in government from Cornell University and a master's degree in public policy from Princeton University. I'm also very pleased to welcome Ms. Hae Jung-moon, a Deputy Director in the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Office of Africa and Middle East, where she oversees an office that manages foreign assistance programming in over 35 countries, working to build capacity of police and corrections officials, judges, prosecutors, and other stakeholders involved in issues such as combating corruption and transnational crime and access to justice for population. Ms. Moon previously served as INL's Office of Knowledge Management, including a team of criminal justice sector experts, served as a temporary assignment as the INL Kyiv Director, responsible for programming over $400 million in response for the war in Ukraine, was interim INL director in Embassy Manila for working for the Philippines on drug demand, law enforcement, maritime security, and environmental crime, and oversaw the creation of security and justice sector reform programs following the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa. She also managed over $200 million in rule of law programs in Iraq and sub-Saharan Africa, as well as a program for police for UN peacekeeping missions, and worked at the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi and as an intelligence analyst. Prior to joining the department, Ms. Moon worked on sovereignty and succession and refugee issues for an NGO and a telecom regulatory consultant. Ms. Moon received her BA from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and her JD and MA from American University. Great to have another AU alum with us today. Before we head into questions, I'd like to remind our in-person and online audience members that this is an on-the-record discussion that will account for audience questions in the last 15 minutes of today's panel. Please field any questions that you have in the chat forum or raise your hand when we approach the Q&A session. I would like to start out to Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich. Last June, the State Department debuted its Counter-Captagon strategy. In the years since, I want to know, how has the State Department, along with other U.S. agencies and departments, built upon this interagency Counter-Captagon strategy? And what are its goals for 2024 and for 2025?
Okay, thank you, Caroline, and thanks for the kind introduction and for inviting us to talk with you today. Looking at your question, I'll start by saying that since the department published the strategy last year, we've been working closely with other U.S. government agencies on this issue. And in keeping with the strategy's line of effort, we're focused on assisting regional partners in their Counter-Captagon efforts. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and building coordinated approaches to addressing the regional challenges posed by Captagon. So Hae-Young will speak in more detail on specific programmatic counter-narcotics efforts, but what I'm going to do is frame out the Counter-Captagon efforts in terms of the broader U.S. policy, especially in Syria. So I'll review what is the broader U.S. policy on Syria. We're focused on stabilizing the situation in Syria and making progress toward a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political solution to the conflict. And that would be in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. The pillars of our policy include maintaining the existing local ceasefires, ensuring that ISIS cannot resurge, expanding humanitarian access, and promoting accountability and justice. So we believe that progress on each of these pillars is what we need to help advance the UN's efforts to reach the political solution to the Syrian crisis. And we firmly believe that a political settlement that reflects the will of Syrians is the only solution to the Syrian conflict. And coming back to our topic today, any such resolution to the conflict would have to both implicitly and more explicitly address the Captagon issue as a problem area of behavior by the regime. So from a diplomatic perspective, we've been in close coordination with the United Kingdom and with like-minded European partners and with the Office of the Special Envoy for Syria at the UN. And we also work with affected countries in the region to explore ways to advance a political solution in line with Resolution 2254 and to press the Assad regime to make the much-needed reforms, such as curbing Captagon production and trafficking. Of course, it's not lost on us that the Assad regime is the key culprit behind the Captagon trade. So we also continue to underscore the need for regional partners to put pressure on the regime. The US continues to do just that through the use of sanctions and other tools. For example, on March 26th, the Department of the Treasury designated 5 individuals and 6 entities for supporting the Assad regime. These included sanctions on a Syrian national and his companies that have facilitated Captagon trafficking throughout the Mediterranean. The recently enacted Captagon Trafficking Suppression Act, also known as Captagon 2, gives the administration an additional tool to go after those involved in Captagon trafficking, whether or not they are directly benefiting the Assad regime. We continue to work closely with our interagency partners to identify additional key persons involved in Captagon trafficking who could be sanctioned under our authorities, including the Caesar Act and Captagon 2. Our sanctions are not the only tool we're using. At state, NEA, the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau, and INL, the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, continue to work closely, both here and in Washington, and at our posts to provide assistance to Lebanon and Jordan. And as Haejung can share, there are also a variety of other tools that INL is looking at to address the Captagon issue. So I'll leave that one for you. But we hope to continue all of these lines of effort through this year and into next year. And we have to emphasize that there are no short-term solutions for addressing what's clearly a growing problem. So we are especially keen to equip other countries in the region to better address these challenges together.
Thank you. Question to Deputy Director Moon. So the United States and its partners were starting to witness spillover of production in Syria, but then also Iraq. There was a small-scale laboratory that was identified in southern Iraq last year. Jordan has started to experience violent clashes and a struggle with trafficking operations into its territory. And additionally, we've seen some small-scale evidence of production inside mainland Europe, with facilities found in countries like Germany and Austria, the Netherlands. How is INL perceiving this network expansion in the Captagon industry? What tools does it have with its disposal to work with partners in improving interdiction efforts?
Good morning. Good morning. First of all, thank you, Caroline, and to your organization for having us come here and speak on this very important topic. If it's okay, I'm just going to spend actually like a quick minute, just because I don't know if a lot of people realize that within the Department of State, which most people associate with policy and diplomacy, which we do very much engage in, that there is the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, INL, who has been working for over 4 decades with other host foreign partners in supporting their efforts at combating transnational crime, whether it's on trafficking of illicit goods, especially narcotics, but also on corruption issues, also on illegal illicit financing, a whole range of, again, everything that is related to criminal activities that crosses borders. Because at the end of the day, they're all linked together, right? The illegal profiteering from the narcotics trafficking and production, that maybe these illegal profits are used for other nefarious acts. And so a lot of these things that we do see as interconnected issues. And so a lot of the tools that we do have may touch directly on one specific issue, but have indirect impact on others. And also fueling some instability in the regions. And so just wanted to relay that, and that, yes, we do work across, holistically across the whole criminal justice sector, because it's not just, addressing it in one specific way, of course. And there, of course, there's no cookie cutter approach. So we do work with all of our partner countries or even with some civil society and others to address these transnational crime. And oftentimes we do rely also and work with other U.S. Law enforcement agencies and other partners, just heading at it as an interagency effort. So as I mentioned, specifically on narcotics, when we were first created, of course, we focused a lot on plant-based drugs. And over the years, we've shifted a lot of the attention on synthetics. And I think what's important is when we first started looking at it, we started talking about fentanyl and opioids. But obviously, I think the fact that we've now are looking at it as synthetics and looking at stimulants, I think that's big. And that talking about the reach of especially a drug like Captagon, that it's garnered so much attention because of the increase that we're seeing and well, specifically in the region, but also just synthetics in general. And so I cover Middle East and Africa, but we're seeing some, for instance, meth labs cropping up in Africa and other parts. So it is a global-wide issue, and we're trying to address it. With that said, we are very, of course, concerned about the expansion of Captagon in the region. And last year, our secretary launched the Global Coalition to address synthetics in July, which we'll talk about in a bit. We've also, of course, co-drafted the Captagon strategy with our colleagues in NEA, with much support from Congress. I think that's also been a key component, having that support from Congress to be able to do the work that we're trying to do. As I mentioned, the increase that we're seeing, the expansion of the Captagon market, I mean, as you mentioned, to Europe, we're seeing that driven by immense profits in the consumer markets. I mean, it comes to demand and supply as well. It's getting made more cheaply. It's also, the demand is also, we're seeing increases, and we're seeing it being used also in everyday use, right? It's not just for a certain group. Now we're talking about people using it to actually function every day, maybe in their day-to-day jobs. So it is concerning that you're starting to see that it's like everyday, I don't know how else to say it, everyday use. Everyday people are using it. The way we view it is a regional issue, a regional threat, challenge that really requires a regional solution. We can't just have one country coming at it on their own. It really requires everyone to collaborate and cooperate. So a lot of tools that we have been that we've developed over the years, and a lot of things that we are doing since, especially the past year, since the passage of since the release of the strategy. On the bilateral front, INAL continues to work with a lot of the countries in developing programs to address that, whether in the region or across in the country. For instance, Jordan, and I should say we're looking at it holistically. Again, you can't just look at it as, oh, let's look at interdiction across the borders of the drug flow. Well, let's also look at it from a public health perspective as well. So, for instance, in Jordan, we're looking at, or we've started developing programs to look at, or right now we don't have a lot of information, so looking at drug, a baseline, trying to get baseline information and doing a drug study so that we could actually find out more information on who's using it, where, how, so that we could actually be smarter about the issue and the demand. Because again, like for instance, Jordan used to be more of a transit country, but now it's becoming more of a consumer country as well. So how's it being used? Why? Why is it so easily accessible? And then we could develop better programming with the government and in the region with other countries to address it. Again, looking at it maybe from a public health perspective as well as other, like a law enforcement perspective. We're designing some projects to, again, head at investigation of some of the drug cases, but working with law enforcement, the public security director in Jordan and the anti-narcotics department, but also having them match up and working with the intel analysts within another part of it's sort of like encouraging interagency approach within some of our partners to work and use each other's information to approach it from the law enforcement angle. We're also doing some targeted public campaign or designing some projects aimed at public campaign awareness in Jordan as well, because again, it's not just the law enforcement, but it's also working with the public. So those are some bilateral things. Iraq, we've been looking at, and it's interesting because working on Iraq many, many years ago in the 2000s, the use of stimulants did come up even back then. It wasn't, again, garnered as much attention, so it's good to know that right now we're looking at that. But again, our challenge is some of the limited information that we have. And just trying to be able to get that in some of these places. So it's more on the bilateral front. And I should also note, I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time, but it's not just INL. We have other partners, other colleagues within the State Department who are, say, looking at working with labs, for instance, in Jordan, to accredit them so they can identify the type of drugs being used or the chemicals being used. I know there are other agencies within the U.S. government who's working along the borders again at interdiction. So it's a whole of government approach. Now, that's on the bilateral side and what we're doing directly with these governments. On the multilateral, I mean, there are other toolkits that we've been using on the multilateral side. We use the multilateral fora and platform to advance and advocate for certain things to combat drugs. For instance, the UN Commission on Narcotics and Drugs. INL represents the U.S. government at these sessions. In the last session, in addition to encouraging international cooperation with the member states, we were able to encourage and have other members vote to agree to place caps, place controls on 18 synthetics. And that was over a few months ago. So that makes it harder on synthetic precursors. So it makes it harder for people to gain access to these chemicals to produce these drugs in the labs. We also do things like supporting the International Narcotics Control Board, which provides, it's an information sharing platform for members as well. And it's a great, it helps other members notifying their international counterparts of chemicals that are being exported as well through the borders, or if there are interdictions. So again, it's a platform for information sharing. Other things we do, the UN Toolkit, to have access to technical assistance. A lot of things about, I actually just stopped right there.
No, this is excellent. And I think, I was talking with someone just outside. In just 2 years, the U.S. interagency strategy has been extremely busy behind the scenes, but then also, of course, with the imposition of sanctions, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich just mentioned. There's a lot to be done when coordinating, sharing intelligence, and really sharing best practices with our partners abroad. Talking about the security and political dimension of the trade, kind of pivoting back, Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich, I'd like to ask you, there's been a lot of research and documentation and evidence collected about how the Syrian regime specifically and its apparatus has wielded and used Captagon manufacturing and distribution networks, as well as there's alignments with Hezbollah, Iran-backed militias operating in the region with these trafficking routes. With recent Captagon-related clashes along Syrian borders and evidence of Captagon being used as an alternative revenue stream, how does the Captagon trade pose a challenge to U.S. security interests in the region? And how do you see that evolving over the next year?
Thanks. That's an important question. So we continue to assess that the Assad regime and a variety of other actors are involved in producing and trafficking Captagon from Syria, including individuals affiliated with Hezbollah. Captagon certainly affects each of the 3 countries under my purview as desk for the Levant: Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. But as I'm sure everyone in the room is aware, each of these countries also faces broader security challenges that we're trying to address. For example, the same networks trafficking Captagon across Lebanon and Jordan's borders with Syria are also smuggling weapons and people. And in Syria, we have seen reports of Captagon distribution and use in both northwest and northeast Syria that are products of the ongoing instability in the country. So we're looking at the Captagon problem in the context of these broader security challenges, and our assistance reflects this. So now I'll maybe go country by country. So for Syria, I'm going to start in northeast Syria. We are working to build the capacity of the internal security forces in the Northeast. Those are the internal security forces related to our partner force, the Syrian Democratic Forces in the Northeast, to provide community security. One component of which is training the ISF officers there on identifying and disrupting Captagon trafficking. So that's in a non-regime area of Syria where we are able to do that with the local internal security force. Our approach to civilian security challenges in Syria is holistic. We seek to work closely with the local communities in identifying and responding to the various security concerns. The effects of increasing drug addiction is consistently one of the top concerns raised by communities in Northeast Syria. So again, I'm talking about non-regime area. Those efforts are a component of our broader efforts to stabilize areas liberated from ISIS and to build local capacities to provide security in Northeast Syria. Our support to the ISF in Northeast Syria is just one part of a multifaceted stabilization strategy that includes a range of activities aimed at establishing the conditions for a return to normalcy and to prevent a resurgence of ISIS. So that's our larger objective in the Northeast relates to the counter-ISIS effort and preventing the resurgence of ISIS. Turning to Lebanon. In Lebanon, the Department of State continues to support the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese internal security forces to help ensure that they are able to continue operating to safeguard Lebanon's internal security and territorial integrity, including against the threats that are posed by drug trafficking. And then in Jordan, there's a strong political will in Jordan to address illicit drugs and to disrupt the smuggling networks, which represent a risk to Jordanian security and to the region. In Jordan, the United States continues to support the Jordanian armed forces as they strengthen their border security, while also helping Jordan's public security directorate reduce the impact of illegal narcotics on local communities. U.S. assistance helps to ensure that law enforcement and border security officials have the necessary training and equipment to counter illicit trafficking, which includes a major focus on strengthening their investigative capacity while adhering to the rule of law. As a close and enduring partner, Jordan's security and its leadership in the region are key to a secure and stable future for the region.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's a great overview looking at how the United States is coordinating with these key security partners that, of course, are witnessing and experiencing a lot of these clashes and also threats to immediate security. I want to focus a bit on this launched global coalition. And Deputy Director Moon, last summer, Secretary of State Antony Blinken launched this initiative. And as we've seen, this global surge in synthetic production and distribution and consumption, a large focus of the coalition naturally is on fentanyl. However, there could, of course, be space for other synthetic substances like Captagon to be incorporated into some of these discussions. How does INL perceive these pathways to incorporate more Counter-Captagon collaboration into this forum? And could it be used as a mechanism or a framework for greater regional collaboration?
Short answer, absolutely. So I think, as I mentioned before, the fact that it's called the Global Coalition on Synthetics speaks volumes that it is that we're including a broader range of the type of drugs or synthetics being used. What's been great as a follow-up is that, when we launched it, there were about 80 countries represented and about 15 or so international organizations. And, we weren't sure the impact so far, the fact that it is going strong, because if people in case people are not familiar with it, it was a way to bring countries together again to talk about the issue and to come to some consensus. And coming out of that, a lot of the countries did sign on to the declaration on, and I always forget the name, Declaration on Accelerating and Strengthening the Global Response to Synthetic Drugs. Now, what does that mean? Under the coalition, there are 3 working groups. One on interdiction and more like the hard, the law enforcement sort of response, preventing the illicit manufacturing, production, all of that. There's a working group then also on emerging drug threats and patterns, because of course, I'm sure there's going to be something new coming, emerging, of course, to replace maybe others. And then, as I mentioned, there's also looking at it from a public health perspective as well. So what's been great is these working groups and different countries are represented on the working groups, and they've continued to have to meet and discuss, and a lot of them are led by other countries. It's not a U.S.-led thing. It's a global coalition. With again, now we are over 150 countries participating. And within, we also have sub-working groups and who are meeting every month. And what's been great is when we go and meet with some of these other countries for something completely different, unrelated. I mean, I was in another country a couple months ago talking to the Ministry of Justice, and they were just coming back from a call, one of the monthly calls for this sub-working group, and talking through, we were just talking through, again, I'm not naming names, but other countries and how we could approach this, because it's an issue that is very much at our forefront as well. And so that was really good to hear that all these countries, it wasn't just a one-time thing, that they're following up. Now, specific to Captagon and Middle East, as a follow-on to that, INL is actually planning something similar, a Middle East drug dialogue for the region specifically to look at Captagon for later this summer. We're going to be probably having it in Budapest to bring everyone together, again, to share information, best practices, and what do we want to do and how do we want to approach this moving forward. And I think the key is, again, it's not U.S.-led, it's a region-led by the countries. And what we've been trying to do is just, again, encouraging other countries to talk to each other, encouraging countries to participate in these. We have all these tools available, and just encouraging them to work together, share information, while at the same time continuing on the multilateral front, leveraging some of the other ways that we could get international cooperation that way. So I'll stop there as well.
No, I think that's great. And it's a great segue into our next question, which of course relates to normalization. But, prior to this, we've seen a number of forums, become established for combating synthetic drugs like Captagon. Some in the region, for example, there have been Interpol forums on the Captagon trade. But some of these forums have included the Syrian regime, which evidence shows, is a direct sponsor of Captagon production and distribution within the region. And there is that question of trust, and trust that is the foundation for intelligence exchange and discussion. So pivoting a bit to that element, Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich, my question is, we've seen the topic of Captagon emerge in normalization discussions last summer, last spring, between regional counterparts and the Syrian regime. There have been a range of different approaches, from transnational strategies to, quote, buy Damascus out of participating in the trade, to direct collaboration, such as counter-narcotics working groups and trainings. How does the United States perceive Captagon as a tool of normalization and rapprochement in the region?
Okay. So let me take a step back first to talk about what it is that we're doing, because we're certainly not normalizing with the regime or supporting those who are. But what we are doing is coordinating. So we're coordinating with partners at the UN, in Europe, in the region. And we're still aiming at our objectives, which are to make progress toward a political solution and to push for reform. So addressing Captagon trafficking is a key pillar of the coordination, not only because of the trade's impact on the health of people who live in the region and security in the region, but also because the revenue from the Captagon allows the Assad regime to fund its ongoing repression of Syrians and to stymie the political process. So what we've made clear publicly and also privately with our partners and with everyone else is that we didn't agree with the Arab League's decision last year to reactivate Syria's membership in the league and to lift its suspension. But after it happened, we tried to work with the countries that were engaging with the Syrian regime to try to better shape the engagements so they would aim at achieving our shared goals in Syria. So addressing Captagon trafficking would be high on that list. And we've known, and it's also become apparent to the Arab states that are engaging with the regime, that the regime is not a good faith actor, and that it's denied every attempt to engage in meaningful discussion on resolving the Syrian conflict. So whoever has been engaged with the regime, whether it's the UN, which does it, under a Security Council resolution, or other countries which decided to do it for their own reasons, everyone, comes back with the same result that, the engagements aren't going anywhere. They're not moving toward achieving a result. So as we've stressed to our partners, there's a need to coordinate on our efforts, and we've cautioned them that they shouldn't be making premature concessions to the regime and giving something for nothing. And so certainly the Captagon issue fits into that context. We also remind them that our sanctions are still in force. Especially the Caesar Act sanctions, and they remain fully in effect. And we will continue using our sanctions to go after the regime's illicit activities. And of course, we continue to reiterate our opposition to reconstruction, which benefits the regime and the people surrounding the regime. And we've urged countries in the region not to take actions that could expose them to our sanctions. And we've also reminded them, why our sanctions are there, and the things that the regime would really have to do to see any change in the circumstance by starting to comply with Resolution 2254 and making the meaningful and enduring changes in the situation. So what we think should be happening is that we should all continue to use the collective leverage that we have to push the regime toward reforms that need to happen, and ultimately to re-engaging in the UN-facilitated political process. But the political process is really the only way out of the crisis, and toward a Syria that's not going to be a source of instability in the region. So it's a little longer answer to the question.
No, it's great, because I think it shows that the Captagon trade has been used both as a political tool, leverage, pressure, but then additionally, you have producers that are also trying to creatively identify loopholes with sanctions, and then also, national and international control regimes as well. That leads me to my next question about these loopholes with sanctions, but then also international national regulations. Deputy Director Moon, as Captagon producers and traffickers seek new ways to creatively find ways to bypass sanctions, interdiction, even just broader accountability, it's vital that governments actively compile a comprehensive picture of how these networks are operating. Precursor supply, trafficking methods, production processes. But intelligence sharing is not always easy, despite the boost it can give to tip-offs, arrests, and interdictions. How can the United States in this interagency strategy lead efforts in sharing this intelligence and encouraging partners to do the same? I know you briefly talked about, the INCB Project Ionics platform. what tools do we have in our toolkit to pursue greater intelligence sharing and trust building amongst regional counterparts?
So I don't want to sound like a broken record, but a lot of what we have been doing are similar, again, encouraging that, a few different ways. Continue to hold global and regional events so that we are bringing together other countries and encouraging others to share information. And whether that's us continuing to fund or support these multilateral global platforms like within the INCB to provide the information sharing platform, or even working directly with countries. I mentioned the Middle East Drug Dialogue, for instance. That is one of the first of its kind where we're bringing together these countries to, now that we've had this global discussion, and of which actually I should mention a lot of the countries in the region, Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, others participated in. Now we're bringing it to a smaller group to make it a little bit more productive discussion and within what can we do as a region. So again, encouraging that cooperation. Providing, we could also lead by example. For instance, the U.S. government working with other countries, working with other agencies, even within the U.S., to share that information and showing that how it could be done as well, or how we do it, or how some of the best practices are. There are a few information sharing other centers, I would say, that not INL, but other maybe U.S. government agencies and others are supporting, for instance. And I mentioned this because I think we had a couple of colleagues earlier that I met from DOD, and I know that they're supporting a regional narcotics information or intel fusion center in Bahrain. Precisely, they created a new or established a new facilities to combat drug trafficking within Middle East. I know supporting something similar along the West Indian Ocean. Again, not the same region, but just talking about some illustrative ways or things that we have been doing globally, or providing support to similar type of intel fusion centers to look at the trafficking of drugs coming through like the Mozambique Channel and coming down from Afghanistan down along to Africa. So there are intel sharing centers and platforms around the world that I know, some of which that I know is providing, whether it's the like the technical system, or it's helping with providing advisors who are serving in those facilities, or again, encouraging other countries in the region to come together and actually share information in that way, SOPs, best practices, those type of, again, that direct, the support that we're providing to those countries. And you mentioned, sorry, just because you did mention, and Das Goldridge also mentioned the accountability tools, all the different sanctions tools. And INL does work very closely with Treasury Department, for instance, on the OFAC sanctions and on whether it's TCO designations or narcotics designations. And a lot of that also involves sharing information. Otherwise, we can't do it alone. And so that's another example of where we lead by example. We have to share information in order to be able to designate, in order to have the correct information to designate and place sanctions on the right groups or the right people. And that sometimes involves, yes, reaching out to other countries and asking, and just we share information, and we would expect the same. And I think, again, by example, it's not just sanctions, but also visa restrictions. Again, we work closely with other countries as well on placing restrictions on individuals' ability to travel, not just to the U.S., but other countries in the region. And again, that involves a lot of collaboration with these other governments. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one other thing that is not sort of related, but just because we haven't talked about it, but also relying on the public. It's not just about information and intel sharing from governments, government to government, but it's also relying on the public for information. And that's where some of the public awareness campaigns that we've been doing come into play. I know Ashley also manages the Narcotics Rewards Program, where the public could call in, and if provides financial incentive for individuals to provide information. And a few months ago, we had, I think, a $1 million reward that we had offered that led to the arrest and extradition of a narco trafficker in Kenya, actually. So these, again, working not just with government to government, but also with the public and getting that information and to your point, building that trust. We provide some. We can't just always expect it to be one way.
Absolutely. Before we go into public Q&A, I have one last question for you both. We'll start with Das Goldridge. What are the trends you're both concerned about the Captagon trade looking ahead into 2025 and beyond?
As New Alliance Institute has reported and others have reported, the Captagon trade spans a wide range of countries and multiple continents. So we're concerned about the trade's growing scale, as indicated by reports of Captagon production in Europe. And I'm guessing INL is even more concerned about the growing scale, since my responsibility is for 3 countries, with a very problematic nexus to the issue. But as the problem spreads, I think we should all be concerned for the implications of that. But we're particularly concerned from where I am that the instability and worsening humanitarian conditions inside Syria may fuel Captagon production outside of the regime areas and cause growing consumption throughout the country. As we were talking about earlier, even in a place like Jordan or whatever, places that used to just be transit locations, the stuff is coming through and people inevitably try it or start using it. Humanitarian needs are at the highest that they've been in Syria, and donor funding, unfortunately, across the board is going down with competing obligations for humanitarian assistance. So Captagon will look to very desperate people as a lucrative and enticing trade. So these are all trends that I think we should be watching and concerned about going forward into the next year.
Absolutely. Deputy Director.
Well, I know you guys do a lot of research, so you probably have more data on this, but I think for us, in general, we're just concerned about a lot of the general trends. The expansion of Captagon into the new markets, a lot of what I've already said before in terms of the linkages to other things. What are they using the funding, the money for? These nefarious groups, the fact that they keep producing more and more and finding new markets. And I think the fact that, mentioning that it's not just being used by a certain group anymore or one type of group, the fact that as the groups are looking for new markets, that they're targeting every day, people who are just maybe needing it for every day, just for a pick me up for if you're doing shift work or you're feeling a little tight. So the fact that they're reaching out and targeting now all these new markets, that could be, it could be anybody in the neighborhood, in the neighborhood or so forth. And also the fact that keeping up with this very prolific and enterprising groups. We know, again, for instance, the production in Syria is increasing and they're finding ways to make it cheaper. No matter, it's keeping up. We could be utilizing all these tools, but sometimes they're going to be one step ahead. And so trying to keep up with that and trying to figure out what's next, where are they reaching out to? And then it's not just Captagon, but is that going to, in addition to the new markets, are they expanding into different types of the synthetics, different types even within Captagon, using different chemicals? Like we mentioned, we could be placing bans on certain chemicals, and then they'll find a different way to produce it in a slightly different way that is finding the loopholes that you mentioned. So everything, I would say everything is of growing concern for us.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I'd like to open the floor up for a public Q&A session. We have some participants online as well that I, of course, can read some questions from. But are there any questions we have from our live audience? Yes.
Thanks, Caroline. Mohammed Ghanem with the American Coalition for Syria and the Syrian American Council. I have a question. It's really a concern that our community has regarding operational integrity and planning, especially as it relates to information security and intelligence sharing. So as you know, the Assad regime is the primary sponsor, the godfather of this trade. And the countries that have been most impacted by the trade are also, or have also been for the past year, involved in a normalization process with the Assad regime, restoring ties with the Assad regime. So how do we keep the information that we're sharing with them? And we would love it, well, of course, we would like the U.S. government to work with them. But how do we keep the information, the intelligence that we're sharing with them about our plans to put out the fire from reaching the arsonist?
That's a good question. We don't normally talk much about how we protect intelligence information and that kind of thing in public forum, but we certainly have processes for doing that if in fact any of that information would even be involved in this kind of cooperation that we have with other states. But I don't know if you have anything further.
That is tough. And that is, first of all, I don't like to say intel sharing so much as information sharing, because that, especially since we work so closely with law enforcement and just how sometimes people could perceive that for the very reason that you could use, sometimes information could be misused or whatnot. But it is tough because we don't work directly with the government. And so sometimes it goes back to the working with other countries on the information, and then and other groups. I know, for instance, I say we, but it's our colleagues in India working with groups within Syria on some law enforcement type as well. So while we're not working directly with the government and we're not sharing necessarily information, it's working with others who may have similar information, and just working with trying to say in I don't know how much we could share, but.
And we provide training, or we coordinate on strategies, and we're working with, like as I was saying, the internal security forces in Northeast Syria on the capacities for police-like organizations, and so I think we're more focused on that. We're also, I think, focused on some of the issues related to the consumption of the drugs, to the issues that the countries should be working within the communities to try to prevent usage and consumption. And so there are a lot of different aspects to this that shouldn't be of concern, that somehow the wrong information will get into the wrong hands or whatever, and more on how we can positively help these countries protect themselves against a threat that they too have a motivation to make sure that the Syrian regime and other malign actors are not benefiting, because otherwise it's going to undercut their own objective to keep the Captagon trade from coming through their country and disrupting the countries.
Absolutely. Harm reduction awareness campaigns, crucial components. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes, Carol.
I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute and a co-founding member of the Observatory of Political and Economic Networks. My question to you is, what are the main knowledge gaps for you when it comes to the Captagon threat? Where do you think think tanks and researchers should focus their efforts?
I'll be frank. There is a big knowledge gap, like I said, and I think the challenge, and I'm not sure how. I don't have a perfect answer for this, but the challenge is with the region. It is so hard. I mean, we do a lot of assessments. We have access to all these tools. We have access to subject matter experts, but in the region, the challenge is getting to some of these places and talking to the public, and then there's still some insecure environments, for instance, within the region. So trying to go, it's not as easy for us to go to certain borders, for instance, or even talking to, accessing some of the communities to, again, talk to everybody to collect that data. So, for instance, I mentioned Jordan. Well, they're a great partner, right? We have access to information. We could travel within and do these baseline studies. But it's not as easy, saying going to the border or certain parts. Like we obviously can't go. Well, We don't go into Syria and talking to the communities and trying to get eyes on or try to get eyes on certain where the production labs are and things like that. So that is a challenge to being able to actually get information from certain places because we can't talk to the communities. We can't put eyes on where these type of facilities. So that's been a hurdle for us.
And then more specifically, we know there's some kind of role that Hezbollah is playing. We know that the Iranian-aligned groups are playing some kind of role. Less clear how the direct role of Iran would work, or if they're playing a direct role, or but that would certainly be something we'd like to know more about, and plugs in, I think, to the larger question of Iran's disruption in the region and what Iran has been doing in the current regional crisis and stuff like that. So to look at the groups that are affiliated with them and how the connections work from the Captagon trade through those groups, and if they go beyond those groups.
Yeah, many blind spots that I think research institutions and think tanks can look into. Any other questions that we have from our live audience? If not, I'll look on our online. Yes, of course, correct.
Thank you so much for this. You
Sorry.
talked about the sanction on Syria. I'm Karal Abdari from Iraqi Embassy. You talked about the sanctions on Syria. The Syrian people suffer more from these sanctions than the Syrian regime. We have lived in the sanction in Iraq. And these sanctions have not weakened Saddam's regime in that time. Is there an approach to prevent the impact of sanctions on the Syrian people? Thank you.
So I think our sanctions were designed to avoid impact on the Syrian people, are designed to target the leadership and the people that surround the leadership. Many times during this administration, we've tried to get out good information on what the sanctions do require, what they don't require, to avoid over-compliance, to people doing things that are not required by the sanctions, and at times to ensure humanitarian assistance is able to move. Like after the earthquake, we had a temporary general license in place to make it even more explicit how to get assistance in humanitarian assistance to help the Syrian people. So in all those circumstances, we're always trying to make sure that people understand how the sanctions work, what the sanctions are for. We're not trying to hurt the Syrian people, and if there's something that we can adjust or fix, our Treasury Department always takes a look at that. And then the larger question of the aim of the sanctions, the Syrian regime needs to look at why we have those sanctions in place and what it would have to do someday for there to be a change. So that's something that we talk to all governments about, including the states from the Arab League that are now involved in engaging with the Syrian regime, and we know Iraq is part of the Arab Contact Group that is involved in that engagement. But the sanctions could be a useful tool, to if a country's talking to the regime, they should remind it, this is why those sanctions are there. Why don't you change this and that behavior and work with the UN? And that would put you on the path toward a different situation.
Do we have any other audience questions? It doesn't look like we have any online. So with that, I really want to thank both panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules, especially May. May seems to be a very crazy month for many, and expand on how the United States is building on its interagency strategy to counter the Captagon trade. I was talking with someone about this in the hallway, but we've been at this now for a few years, and this year we were really able to reflect on this interagency strategy and bring representatives from the U.S. Department of State to talk about it. It's really wonderful, and it's a privilege to have you both here to just reflect on what has been accomplished and what can be accomplished. Thank you also to our online participants and those who came out here in person, especially on an early Wednesday morning, and for being with us and posing such great questions. This concludes our second panel in the Captagon Trade Conference. We're not done yet. Our last panel takes place tomorrow. My colleague, Dr. Karam Shah, is going to be leading that discussion at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Captagon's footprint in the Middle East and Europe, featuring representatives from the Jordanian, Iraqi, German, French, and Qatari governments. You can register on the New Lines Institute Eventbrite page or watch a recording on our YouTube page as well. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely rest of your day. Please feel free to finish. We have some breakfast in the back. And thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.